This is Brother Brandon Sankara on Freedom Now at KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles. And I have the privilege of being joined on the line by sisters Inemesit Richardson and Falou Balora, representing the Thomas Sankara Center for African Liberation and Unity, based in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso. Thank you very much for joining us. And how are you both doing this morning?
We're both doing really well. It's sunny and bright out here in Ouagadougou. Thank you
Nice.
so much for having us on. We're so excited to be on the show.
Right on. And with all the activity going on there in the Sahel region today, we are very excited to have you guys on to give us some important context and perspective. So let's dive right in. Can you guys tell us when and why the Thomas Sankara Center was founded?
Okay, so the Thomas Sankara Center has been around almost 2 years now. It's going on 2 years. Um, so I co-founded it with somebody from Burkina Faso out here named Wenlesida Sempore. And Fatou, who's on with me, was one of the first people to join in with us and really get the ball rolling on this project. Um, it was founded in response to a growing heightened sort of mass consciousness across the Sahel region and a desire um, to do something in the legacy of Thomas Sankara, as well as to make connections across the diaspora and various parts of the continent to Burkina Faso, a country that was at the time sort of emerging out of this uprising that happened in 2014 and starting to reconnect with its revolutionary heritage. So the Thomas Sankara Center, that's basically, it was born out of that desire.
Mm-hmm. And what are the primary activities and goals of the center?
So the Thomas Sankara Center is a political education center, first and foremost. So we run a revolutionary Pan-African library where we distribute books that are pretty much otherwise unavailable in Burkina Faso. So we have books by, of course, Thomas Sankara, but also Kwame Nkrumah, Frantz Fanon, Assata Shakur, all sorts of African revolutionaries. So we make those available to the public. People come and check those books out. We also have a lot of political education programming. So we have a Young Pioneers program for primary school youth. That would be like the equivalent of elementary schoolers. So mostly ages 8 to 14 or so, who they come, they learn about the history of Pan-Africanism. They learn about the different resources that are found all across the African continent, and what happens to those resources. And yeah, we do a lot of creative exercises, art, games to raise consciousness with the children. And also, I should mention that it's co-run by a former pioneer. So one of our comrades, Osian Sawadogo, was a pioneer during the Thomas Sankara Revolution. So it's really great that he's also part of this, and we're doing that in that legacy. And then we also have a work study circle that meets weekly at the Thomas Sankara Center. We're reading Africa Must Unite by Kwame Nkrumah right now. We're getting started with a second work study circle that's forming now, which is really exciting. And then outside of that, we have all sorts of events and programming. We do film screenings, anything that raises consciousness in that sort of way with the community. We've been collaborating a lot with the Cuban embassy lately this year, doing a lot of events with them. So I think that gives some idea of some of our regular activities.
Now, you mentioned that the center is named after the country's revolutionary Pan-Africanist president, Thomas Sankara, who was assassinated in a coup d'etat led by Blaise Compaoré on October 15th, 1987. Since this date, would it be correct to say that Sankara's name would be somewhat taboo in the country, given the political leadership that followed his assassination? And with that, can you speak to the role that the 2014 uprising, which ousted the 27-year political leader Blaise Compaoré, in freeing Sankara's name from this taboo?
Okay, I'm going to pass this question to our comrade Falou Balora, because that had a big impact on her, and she was around here in 2014 as this was going on, as somebody who grew up in Burkina.
De Thomas Sankara n'était pas aussi si tabou que ça. C'est vrai que toute activité ou comment on appelle ça, tout programme lié à ce nom était, disons, les gens avaient la crainte de développer toute activité ou tout, comment on appelle ça, programme lié à ce nom. Sinon, en réalité, euh, c'était pas un nom tabou. C'était un nom admiré plutôt dans le silence, mais c'était pas du tout tabou. Mais là, je pense que l'insurrection a beaucoup joué un peu sur ça parce que ça a permis aux gens de comprendre, ça a permis à la population de comprendre leur pouvoir, comment on appelle ça, de comprendre que c'est eux qui peuvent en fait décider de ce qu'ils veulent de leur pays. Du coup, ça a permis cet héritage que Sankara a laissé là, ça a permis à cet héritage de sortir. Voilà, ça a permis aux gens d'exprimer ça librement. Maintenant, les gens peuvent facilement librement dire, oh, je suis Sankara, je suis l'héritier de Sankara, je suis la vocation de Sankara et je suis fière comment on appelle ça, d'avoir eu pour président Sankara et tout ça, en vrai.
So she said that Thomas Sankara's name was never really taboo. People were very afraid to speak about Sankara, but it wasn't really taboo in a sense that he was kind of admired silently. So people were like afraid, but they still held that admiration, even if they didn't necessarily, at the time, have the courage to speak up. But things did really change during the 2014 insurrection because people were able to see just the power of the people, the way that they could transform and affect change through that sort of uprising. And now people come out and are very clear that, you know, we are the daughters and sons of Sankara. We are the inheritance of the Sankara legacy. And so it was just like this big eruption in a more public form of reclaiming the Sankara legacy.
So I see that youth education plays a major role in the Thomas Sankara Center's activities. So given the historical context that you just provided, what has been the reception and response of the Burkinabe youth as they learn the country's history now that there is a total outward embrace of Sankara and the country's revolutionary past?
En fait, je vais encore rejoindre la question précédente pour dire en fait, on connaissait cette histoire. C'était pas une histoire inconnue, une histoire aujourd'hui. Non, on connaissait l'histoire de Sankara. On savait que Blaise a tué Sankara. On savait que Sankara était un président révolutionnaire. Même les grèves à l'école, on criait Sankara, les petites grèves à l'école, au lycée et tout ça, on criait Sankara, le nom de Sankara. On criait justice à Sankara, justice pour Sankara et tout ça. Donc, on connaissait l'histoire. Juste peut-être la manière de l'exprimer, on n'avait pas ce pouvoir de l'exprimer avec, comment on appelle ça, qu'il y ait assez d'effets. Sinon, même nous, les élèves, au lycée, tout ça, à l'école primaire, on sortait dans la rue, pendant les grèves, on criait justice pour Sankara, justice pour Norbert Zongo, et ainsi de suite. Donc, on connaissait, je pense que tout Burkinabé s'intéresse d'une certaine façon à l'évolution du pays, qu'on connaît d'une certaine manière, comment on appelle ça, l'histoire de Sankara et comment ça s'est. Le procès quand on voulait, qu'on exigeait, en réalité, c'était juste pour situer les responsabilités. Si on savait réellement ce qui s'est passé, on sait que c'est Blaise qui a tué Sankara avec, comment on appelle ça, l'appui de l'Occident et tout ça. Même un enfant, il connaissait ça. Donc, je pense que c'est pas l'insurrection qui est venue faire connaître cette histoire. C'est juste que c'est venu faire, comme je le disais, ça a libéré ce courage de nous dire on est fiers d'être enfant de Sankara, on est fiers d'être héritage de Sankara. Sinon, on connaissait l'histoire et c'est juste qu'on ne l'exprimait pas vraiment, quoi. Mais d'une façon aussi, on l'exprimait parce qu'on faisait des grèves et on en parlait, mais on n'exprimait pas réellement comme on l'exprime actuellement, en fait. Sinon, tout enfant connaissait même l'histoire de Thomas Sankara. Parce qu'il a vraiment impacté notre pays, il a vraiment impacté nos parents et jusqu'à présent, ça continue avec nous.
I think what Fatou said was really important here because it's a part of Burkina Faso's history that I think not a lot of people know about. But the insurrection wasn't just like this super spontaneous thing where people got up and they did it one day. The people, even during the Blaise era, there was significant resistance. And so she's talking about how these, like, you know, the children who grew up under Blaise, like herself, they grew up with a consciousness of what had happened to their country and the wrongdoing that was committed. They grew up knowing that Blaise had assassinated Thomas Sankara. They grew up knowing that the Western countries were implicated in this assassination. And I think something that people don't know a lot about is that the children who grew up during the Blaise era actually grew up participating in public protests and mobilizations with their schools. So like from the time of primary, like our equivalent of maybe elementary school, the Burkinabe children would go out with their teachers into the street and cry like justice for Thomas Sankara, justice for Thomas Sankara. So they grew up sort of mobilizing and being encouraged to think politically, even though it was risky and there was suppression during the Blaise era, and there wasn't necessarily the same level of sort of political openness and courage that maybe there is right now. They still kind of did grow up having that ingrained in them, that there was this wrongdoing that was committed in their country and that they were responsible from the time of that they're children for going and alongside the adults and speaking about it in whatever way that they can. And so she said the insurrection, actually what it did was to make people just more like publicly outspoken, but there's those kinds of small forms of acts of resistance. And I would say not even necessarily small, like, elementary schools were mobilizing, but those things had been going on since the time of the assassination. So it's kind of like a reconnection with history, but at the same time, there's always been this sort of desire and this fight to reconnect with that Sankara heritage. It's always kind of been there since the revolution was so abruptly and I think jarringly overthrown.
Okay, with that, bringing the conversation back here to the present, there are some new faces on the scene that are making waves throughout the world. And I'm, of course, speaking to the young leader of the interim government, Ibrahim Traore. Can you share any biographical insights or background on this young, courageous Pan-African leader for our listeners who may be new to hearing his name?
Sure, yeah. So Ibrahim Traore, he is coming up on about a year of power now. I mean, maybe that would be like about a month and some change from today. And so he came into Burkina through a military coup. I'll be transparent and say he wasn't that well known prior to him taking power. So what we've seen is that Burkina Faso has taken a lot of inspiration from the political direction of Mali. So Mali had a coup a couple years prior to Traore taking power in Burkina Faso. And the coup, pretty early on, started positioning itself in a sort of in opposition to France and sort of the traditional Western powers that have dominated in the Sahel. And you really have to understand the level of French control and domination in this region of the world. I mean, it's a part of the world where not only does France occupy these up until recently these countries militarily, but these countries also are tied to France through something called the CFA franc currency, which requires 14 countries in Africa, actually technically 15 if we count Comoros. They have a different name for their system, but it works the same way, to use this currency where they hold half of their national reserves in France. The currency is anchored to the euro, so France determines what the value of the currency is, more or less, and has voting and veto power in the regional banks of both West and Central Africa. So there's massive economic power, massive military power, massive French control over a lot of the resources here. Of course, it's not only France, but France operates maybe the most blatantly and overtly and directly. So there's been like this big rise in anti-imperialist consciousness that's been building for years and years. And I first started spending time in the Sahel region around 2018. And I noticed right away that just everywhere around me in this part of the world, it seemed like people were talking about imperialism, whether it was in barbershops or salons. It just seemed like everybody around me was talking about, the French are robbing us, they're exploiting us, we've been colonized by them for hundreds, like 100 plus years now. So it started with this mass consciousness. And then Mali kind of was the first country to take this move and really position itself away from the Western camp. And so people in Burkina Faso really started anticipating when would they have sort of a leader like Assimi Goïta of Mali. And so there were two coups d'etats that happened in Burkina. The first one was with Damiba, and he exposed himself pretty early on as somebody who was not actually going to take this anti-West, or I should say anti-imperialist, let me say anti-imperialist sort of position. There was a trial for Sankara's assassination. Blaise Compaoré was found guilty, and Damiba immediately pardoned him, which was a huge red flag, and people started to be like, okay, this is not our Mali moment. But then Ibrahim Traoré came around, and what we can say about Traoré is that he chose a prime minister who was very familiar with the people. So even if he himself is kind of a new face, the prime minister he chose was somebody who was involved in the Sankara Revolution as a creator of one of the committees for the defense of the revolution, somebody who's a scholar who's written extensively about Sankara. Sankara invited him to be part of the Burkinabe government at the time of the revolution in the 80s. So that was a really good sign already that, okay, like the prime minister that he selected was a familiar face. And pretty much since Traoré has come to power, there's been massive mobilizations on the grassroots level calling for certain things. And so far, every sort of major demand coming from the bottom has been received by the top. So the French military was kicked out of Burkina Faso. Those accords were ended. There's been a lot of forms of delinking in terms of like media delinking with France, and then approaching certain partnerships that the Burkinabe people see as more beneficial in the long run than these sort of Western NATO partnerships. And then there's also been major calls for a very close relationship with Mali, to such an extent that people on the ground are calling for a United States of Africa in that vision of Pan-Africanism that Kwame Nkrumah, Ahmed Sékou Touré, Modibo Keita had put forward. A lot of people have been calling for that. And so this is something the government has also picked up on, and they've been talking about creating this federation with Mali. Now they're saying that, this is something that they've sat down with Mali. They have a shared military plan. They have a shared plan for industrialization, and that they're working towards having like just unity on every level that they can. It's oftentimes implying that they are working towards this idea of like a federal state between the two countries. And they invited other countries to join. We're not totally sure, I guess, if those other countries have accepted the invitation, but we know for a fact that Guinea, Conakry was invited and Chad was invited to join. And now there's this whole situation with Niger. Burkina Faso and Mali have begun to issue joint declarations on multiple occasions. The situation in Niger is one example of that, where they said that any invasion of Niger will be considered a declaration of war against Mali and Burkina Faso as well. So we're seeing this like very strong push towards unity and federation, which is another demand coming out of really the grassroots out here.
So what I'm hearing is that the people have been waiting a long time for what we're witnessing today. But, I also wonder, has there been any significant and public opposition to the Traoré government?
No, really, there's not major. I haven't seen it. Like people have like critiques of things, which is, I think, any situation we'd always want to be critical. But there's not any like public demonstrations against Traoré or like people saying that, it's just overwhelmingly in favor of the leadership right now.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, Fatou? Est-ce qu'il y a une grande opposition à Traoré? Traoré a pris du soutien parce que pratiquement tout le peuple soutient Traoré. Jusqu'à dire que c'est dans la réincarnation de Sankara que les gens vivent. Donc c'est pour dire à quel point les gens accordent, même des gens, le peuple burkinabé accorde du crédit à President Traoré.
So she basically said she agreed with me that there's like not really an opposition movement. There are criticisms and stuff, but not like anybody saying like down with Traoré, and he's so overwhelmingly popular. People liken him to Sankara and talk about whether or not this is the revival of like the Sankara era. So yeah, he's very supported.
Right. Well, it isn't hard to see the parallels between the Sankara government and Traoré's, especially given his speech, for example, at the Second Russia-Africa Summit in July. In this, he echoed his revolutionary predecessor's sentiments, calling for an end to imperialist influence in Africa. This also goes for his emphasis on African youth unifying across the continent. So, with that, can you speak to the efforts by the Thomas Sankara Center to bring this to fruition and connect and collaborate with like minds across the African continent as well as throughout the diaspora?
Ok, disons que oui, avec la vision qu'on a, une vision panafricaine, c'est normal qu'on aille vers d'autres structures dans la même logique pour essayer de travailler ensemble. Donc oui, le Centre Thomas Sankara a eu à approcher certaines structures ont approché le Centre Thomas Sankara. Néanmoins, on a eu à travailler ensemble avec d'autres structures dans le cadre de l'avancement de l'objectif commun qui est l'unification, la libération totale de l'Afrique. Donc, on a eu pas mal comment on appelle ça, de soutien, si on peut le dire, et on a eu à travailler avec on envisage, on est en train de créer une certaine connexion avec des sociétés au Niger, au Mali et un peu partout dans la diaspora. Voilà, on a eu à faire même, comment on appelle ça, des déclarations de soutien même à d'autres pays comme l'Afrique du Sud, qui n'est même pas l'Afrique de l'Ouest. Ça veut dire qu'on essaie d'extérioriser autant que possible nos relations. Voilà, je pense que si c'est pour répondre vraiment à cette question, le Centre Thomas Sankara essaie de créer une certaine connexion avec les structures partout en Afrique et dans la diaspora.
She said that, we are a Pan-African center, so we do everything we can to connect with other organizations, and like associations and groups that are fighting for Pan-Africanism, fighting for the total liberation and unification of Africa, that we are working to build stronger relationships with organizations in Mali and Niger, but really all over Africa. She talked about how we wrote a declaration in solidarity with Africans who are in South Africa. And so we had a lot of different organizations sign on to that in support. I'll just add on my end, we've done solidarity events with Haiti, with Sudan, with Senegal. So we try our best to, stay in the Pan-African, we're a Pan-African organization. So we try our best to really have that international scope to our struggle and to connect with organizations both on the continent and the diaspora.
Well, now, of course, in my own personal journey to break away from American colonialism and the legacy of slavery, I, like much of my brothers and sisters in that diaspora, was inspired by the work and legacy of Thomas Sankara. And it even led me all the way to change my last name to Sankara. As a result, seeing this modern day manifestation of that revolutionary legacy, I would love to support in any way that I can. And the Thomas Sankara Center seems without a doubt the best means that I see to directly connect with and support the Burkina Faso people. So with that, how can we in the diaspora support your work at the center?
That's so wonderful, and it's so great to hear. And we're really always trying to build that diaspora continent connection. I think already, having us on the show was a great way already to start to give us this kind of support. And now we get to be in dialogue and communication and really know each other and exchange with each other. So I really think that's one way. I will say that the Thomas Sankara Center is 100% grassroots funded. So we're funded entirely by supporters. We have a Patreon, a GoFundMe, and a Cash App, and that's what allows us to continue our work. So if you're interested in that, our Instagram is Burkina Books, and you can find the links to some of those ways to support us materially through there. But I would say other than that, I would encourage people to continue to invite us on programs like this to learn as much as you can about Burkina Faso, the Sahel region, the African continent, so that we can make these sort of connections. And we also encourage Africans, if possible, to come to Burkina Faso, to, connect on the ground here, to get to know the folks who are here. So if that is a possibility for anybody listening, come and visit the Thomas Sankara Center. So that's also another way.
Okay, great. And I want to make sure that our listeners have all of your information to be able to get in touch and support. I know that you mentioned that your Instagram page is at Burkina Books, but can you share your Cash App, Patreon, and any other means for folks to support you guys financially?
Yes, thank you. So our Patreon is patreon.com/Burkina Books. And then our Cash App handle is Burkina Books. We have a GoFundMe. I think if you just search like Burkina Faso Pan-African Education on GoFundMe, you'll find it. It'll probably be the first one that comes up. So yeah, those are the three ways that that you can support us materially. Like I said, it really does go a really long way here. We are entirely grassroots funded, and just really just like a little bit of money goes really a long way out here. So we appreciate that a lot.
Well, unfortunately, we'll have to end it there. But I want to thank you both for joining me on the show this morning, sharing your work and some indispensable context on the current happenings in and around Burkina Faso. Thank you for joining us right here on Freedom Now, Sisters Inemesit Richardson and Falou Balora of the Thomas Sankara Center for African Liberation and Unity in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso.
Thank you so much for having us on. Thank you. We really appreciate it.
Merci beaucoup. Barcoso.
Barguzgo, that's thank you very much in More. Since you call yourself Sankara, you should know how we say thank you very much. So we say Barguzgo.
All right, right on. Well, Bargawoo's go to you and our listeners out there for tuning in. This has been Brother Brandon Sankara for Freedom Now, KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles. Stay tuned for more.